Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to get us started with our webinar. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join. I know everyone has busy schedules and you all could be doing anything at this hour. So the fact that you're tuning in today, we appreciate your time and hope that you will enjoy what we're sharing today and learn some great nuggets to help move your DEI journey forward within your organizations. So I'm going to get started. I'm Natasha Stamper. I'll just give a quick background on myself, introduce our amazing panelists today, and then dive right into why we're all here today. So I'm a first-generation American. My parents are from the Caribbean, both Jamaica and Cuba. I serve as a DEI consultant at Kanarys, and I have the honor and privilege of working with so many amazing clients along their DEI journey. My DEI background spans from multicultural marketing to diversity recruiting, increasing supplier diversity efforts to award-winning status on behalf of AT&T, and helping stand up ERGs and DEI councils. So joining us here today, we have Thomas Savino, CEO of Prospanica. Prospanica is a nationally recognized and premier nonprofit dedicated to developing Hispanic talent and growing the number of Hispanic professionals represented in industries across America to perpetuate economic growth and corporate competitiveness. Founded in 1988 as the National Society of Hispanic MBAs, Prospanica is the Association of Hispanic MBAs and business professionals with more than 47 professional and university chapters across the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and includes a membership base of over 30,000 Hispanic professionals and students. Welcome today, Thomas. Thanks for joining us. Thomas also has a very impressive history of advocating for business education and is a respected executive in the Hispanic community. As an expert consultant specializing in performance measurement analysis, knowledge management, and organizational structure, he has collaborated with corporations and national boards throughout the country. We're honored to have you here today with us, Thomas.
Thank you, Natasha. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Sid Wilson is also joining us today. Sid serves as President and CEO of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility, also known as HACR. As President and CEO of HACR, Mr. Wilson proudly leads the nation's largest advocacy group advancing Hispanic inclusion in corporate America. In addition to conducting valuable research initiatives and advanced professional development programs, HACR creates a forum to ensure corporate responsibility and market reciprocity for the nation's growing Hispanic population. Founded in 1986, HACR is one of the most influential advocacy organizations in the nation, representing 14 national Hispanic organizations in the U.S. and Puerto Rico. Their mission is to advance the inclusion of Hispanics in corporate America at a level commensurate with their economic contributions. To that end, HACR focuses on 4 areas of corporate social responsibility and market reciprocity. That includes employment, procurement, philanthropy, and governance. Thank you very much for taking out your time today to join us today, Sid.
Thank you, great to be here.
And then last but not least, we have Mandy. Mandy is our CEO of Kanarys. She's an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and as the CEO and co-founder of Kanarys, Inc. Kanarys is a technology company focused on providing the tools organizations need to create long-term systemic change around diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges. Working alongside mid-sized enterprises and Fortune 500 companies, Kanarys transforms DEI work with data by providing the framework, benchmarking, and data companies need to incorporate best-in-class DEI into every area of their organization. Like a canary in the coal mine, Kanarys helps organizations ensure healthy work environments by revealing DEI blind spots before they become a problem. Mandy left her career as a Harvard-educated attorney to co-found Kanarys. Her interest in DEI began early in her career when she helped create the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement at the University of Texas as an undergrad student. Mandy has been named a Top 100 HR Tech Influencer of 2021 by Human Resource Executive and recognized by Inc. as one of the top female founders for helping companies address systemic racism in the workplace. Thanks so much today for taking the time out to be with us today, Mandy.
Thank you, Natasha.
So I'd like to just take a few minutes for our audience to really just give them a little bit of background information and provide some background as it relates to our Prospanica Workplace Inclusion and Equity Report to help set the stage for the discussion we'll have today. I've also asked one of our Kanarys to drop a link in the chat to the report so that everyone here can access and read it at a later time if you have not. So to begin and provide some background, in October of 2021, both Kanarys and Prospanica released the first ever Prospanica Workplace Inclusion and Equity Report. Kanarys was really excited to partner with Prospanica on this first ever report, and we hope this research will provide companies with the data they need to better inform their DEI initiatives. The assessment, which polled Prospanica members from across the United States, revealed that over 50% of Hispanic professionals have personally witnessed or experienced discrimination or bias in their workplace, and that 63% of Hispanic professionals felt the burden of teaching or explaining DEI issues to their colleagues. Really, really sad just hearing those statistics. Although the business case is stronger than ever for DEI work, the reality is that progress has been very slow. In order to move the needle in DEI, we know we must address DEI challenges from a systemic standpoint. And one of the keys to doing so is gathering data on the employees' lived experiences to inform an intentional strategy from the ground up. Our joint assessment with Prospanica creates a baseline in evaluating the progress companies have made in supporting Latinx employees and the work that still remains to drive inclusion. In today's webinar, we're excited to talk about some of the report's key findings and discuss ways that organizations can create inclusion and open more doors and opportunities in the workplace for the Hispanic and Latinx community at large. Thank you for joining us today for this very important discussion. So I'm going to start with Sid. Sid, we know that although the representation of Latinos and Hispanics within the U.S. have grown consistently over the past few decades, according to the most recent census data, there's about 62 million Hispanics and Latinos living in the U.S., representing 18.7% of the U.S. population. However, the representation for Hispanic professionals on corporate boards remains consistently low, with the representation only increasing from 0.3% to a total of 4.1% between 2018 and 2020. What are the main obstacles faced by Latinx employees to get board roles and other advisory positions? Start with that one.
Sure. Well, thank you. Let me first start by saying, buenos días, mi gente. And thank you, Kanarys, and thank you, Prospanica, for the opportunity to speak. And I do, of course, want to recognize our HACR Vice Chair of the Board of our Board of Directors, Thomas Savino, and thank you for your leadership. But the question with regards to C-suite and corporate boards and the lack thereof, it boils down to an understanding that the topic has nothing to do with qualifications. I have a saying that show me your qualifications, I'll show you an early career to a mid-level job. Show me the connections, the mentorship, the sponsorship, and I will show you a C-suite and board seat. The reality is that if you are a C-suite executive, you did not get there because of your resume. You got there because of sponsorship. And so companies need to recognize that we have to have not only diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also intentionality. I call it DEI squared. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and intentionality, where companies need to be intentional in saying that if I'm in a room and it's all, say, white men, someone needs to stand up and say, why are there no Latinos in this room? Why are there no Latinas in this room? Because a few key statistics is the fact that not only do we know that we are the 7th largest economy in the world, according to our friends at the Latino Donor Collaborative, but according to HACR's own research, we know that only 1% of all Latinas are on boards. We know that of the 6,000 publicly traded companies, only one, not 1%, just one, is led by a Latina. And so what that means is that there is an issue of a lack of intentionality, and there is a lack of mentorship and sponsorship, because we know that that is the key to get into the C-suite and on boards. So at HACR, we're making sure we're relentless in having companies say, we must do better to be intentional and to make sure that the pathway into the C-suite rises up, and we need the allies, mostly non-Latinos, to say, we stand with you, we lock arms with you, we're going to march with you metaphorically up the corporate ladder from the early career all the way up to the corporate board.
I love that. I'm going to have to use that DEI squared, in, diversity, equity, inclusion, and intentionality. And you're so right. I mean, you have to be intentional about this work. And the fact that you're right, it's not about necessarily your work experience or how hard you work. It's about those connections, about the sponsorship, and those doors being opened by allies. So thank you very much for sharing that today, Sid. The other thing I want to ask, kind of a follow-up, and this may be an opportunity to kind of add on to that, but what are things, and you answered this in part of your previous answer, but what are some of the things that corporate America is getting wrong, and what can they do to improve? So you talked about sponsorship, you talked about intentionality, but what is it that they're getting wrong, and are there any additional areas where they can improve?
Sure. Here's one thing that they're doing wrong. Stop trying to say that this is about a business case. Because the reality is that when someone says, well, make the business case for Latino inclusion, I respond to say, why don't you make the business case for homogeneity of an all-white man board? You make that case to me first, and then I'll talk to you about the business case for Latinos. So we shouldn't have to go an extra hurdle, because we know that we belong, and if given the opportunity to compete, we will win. That's the first part, is recognizing that it's about the culture of belonging. Secondly, is I talk companies when they say, well, we can't find Latinos for these positions. I say, well, stop looking west, looking for a sunrise, because you can throw all the dollars into what we got to do to look west. And I'm telling you, we're throwing all this money looking west, we can't find that sunrise. I say, just turn around, make the 180-degree turn, i.e., are you going to our Hispanic serving institutions to intentionally target? Are you promoting Latinos into the power roles, whether it's a sales and marketing and legal and other key roles? Are you cultivating a culture of belonging, and what are you doing to make sure that we are all part of this? It can't just be people of color that will be the solution for our own inclusion. We need allies to say we all have to be part of this. Every single leader, from the CEO to the corporate director on down. When we see that overall participation, we start to see the needle get moved.
I love that, Sid. And you're right too. It's asking people, where are you fishing, right? Are you going to HSIs? Who's in your pipeline within your organization, right? With just a little bit of coaching and mentoring that could be promoted up within the organization. So thank you so much for sharing that as well. I'm going to move over here to Thomas. I want to talk about representation with internships. So there's a lot of discrepancies we see in representation, and that they're not just at the board and C-suite level. As many employees began working from home, programs such as internships were decreased or dropped entirely with Hispanic intern representation. decreasing from 14% in 2020 to 12% in 2021. Additionally, data collected through the National Association of Colleges and Employers indicate that Hispanic students are underrepresented in paid internships, and a disproportional portion of Hispanic students have never taken part in an internship. My first question to you, Thomas, is how has the transition to remote work specifically impacted Latinx employees and interns?
Thanks for that question, because I think there hasn't been maybe a lot of focus all over on the internship piece that's related to many things. So going to remote, of course, needless to say, first starts with the impact of COVID. And certainly we know Hispanics certainly suffered more greatly in terms of COVID. And what does that mean? Financially, we've suffered, we've been hit hard with the disease, particularly I'll say in the Northeast region for sure. And for a community that has strong family ties and obligations, all these things come into play when we talk about kind of the pipeline that gets us to internships. So yeah, the story for over 10 years has been really quite good. Hispanic enrollment in colleges has been moving up and up, and we've been doing a great job with that. But it stopped. In fact, it went down. More specifically, where it went down is in community colleges, where we have great representation. I think that the enrollment in community colleges is down in the double digits, and those are feeders for your internship programs as well as the undergrad programs. So, going remote, staying home to take care of your family, or having a very negative impact on your family's finances or your own has had a negative impact in terms of going to college, which then feeds the internships. And a lot of internships do, I mean, even now there's some of them are moving around, and we're really tied home with the family obligation. So it's been a very big impact, and it's a concern for the future, because what I might say is in internships, we still needed to do, while this Hispanic enrollment was going up, we still needed to do better on the internship front. And we were still lagging there, and there were still, changes that needed to take place on the internship front. Those are some of the, that's what's happened really. That's a deep concern in terms of, because as I think as your question says, or somewhere in the documentation says, internships are a major feeder, certainly MBA programs. The key is to get an internship to land a good role after you graduate.
Especially when you're talking about internships, it's a lot of times, as you said, a feeder into a full-time role with organizations, and a lot of times the first experience, right, in a working environment. And so to have that in a remote setting can be a little bit harder for young students to be able to adjust in corporate America, working remotely, not being able to have kind of that sponsorship and being able to just build those relationships with other people in the office. And you're right, unfortunately, COVID has really affected our communities more significant than others. And so that has really played a really tough time for students to be able to kind of not only continue college, but being able to get into that work environment and those internships. With a lot of organizations, even knowing that they cut back on some of their programs, having to lay off and cut back with employment opportunities overall. So thank you for sharing that. To follow up with that, Thomas, I also want to ask, what can organizations do to address these disparities, especially since most internship programs are feeder programs for full-time hiring? What can organizations do?
Well, first they have to recognize it, right? There has to be education, and recognition hopefully comes with some action after it, right? I think anytime something's happening that affects negatively any group, you have to be intentional about how you address it. So your abroad getting back to work programs, you may want to think about what specific groups are negatively impacted as you say, go back to work and go back to the office. Again, we've talked about, still there's been a challenge. Sid does great work, specifically at the senior levels and on the board. Still a lot of work already needed to be done structurally. And I think there's been some touches on how do we, I have no problem when we recruit getting Hispanic talent. Yet I hear that old story, I can't get them in the pipeline. And yet, I think there's over 600 Hispanic serving institutions, it might be higher there. I think working with groups like Prospanica, sure, we, again, have no problem finding this talent. And so it's somewhat structural. So where a lot of companies were rethinking their recruiting. And I think they need to move along on that, because it was recruiting for decades was delivering essentially one or two types of personalities and backgrounds, and not enriching their business decisions. So continue on that path. I think, there are other great groups. I mean, working with us there helps them, particularly at a certain level. I see Inroads is in the chat room. What a great group Inroads is to work with. So we're all out there, and these groups be great to work with, and a couple of groups to work with. But recognizing it, addressing your structural, the way you recruit is very important. Kanarys has done some great stuff here with their technology. I think so. Look at those three things, those three areas to think through it, and again, think through when you do your broad policies, how's that affect women? How's that affect this group or that group, Hispanics? Because it will have a different impact in certain groups.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Thomas. I'm actually Inroads alum, and I will say that was super helpful for me in gaining. That's the only reason why I was able to gain so many internship opportunities through that partnership, and it definitely helped shape my future for career employment. With that, I'm actually going to switch over to Mandy here, Mandy, and I want to talk a little bit about focusing on race and gender intersectionality. The assessment found that 53% of Latina professionals report being less likely to feel comfortable expressing all aspects of their identities in the workplace when compared to non-Latinx professionals. And when asked if they believe people of all backgrounds could succeed at their organizations, Latina employees were 47% less likely than non-Latinx individuals to feel that they could. My question to you is, why do you think Hispanic women and Latinas are having such a negative experience in the workplace? What are some specific ways that employers can improve the work experience for Latinas?
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. So unfortunately, women of color just have a different experience in the workplace. This experience is really affected by the perception of their abilities, their skill, and their commitment. And what we see is that women of color, in particular Latinas, are overlooked for promotions. So according to McKinsey, for every 100 men that are promoted to manager, only 85 women were promoted. And then when we look at that gap for women of color, only 58 Black women, only 71 Latinas were promoted. So I think it's really important, and we've talked, all of us, I've heard Sid and Thomas talk about this as well, as far as not saying this is a pipeline problem, because we know that the talent is there and it exists, that employers really need to be asking themselves and looking at how is your organization showing Latinos that their development and growth is important to the organization. How are you supporting them to address the challenges that they face? As women, especially, we know the complications and the increased disparities with respect to intersectionality. And then also asking yourself, right, what is the everyday experiences of Latina in your workplace, and how is that different than a white cisgender male? And how can these differences be addressed? Now, I think one of the first things we can do, right, because one of the things that the report also showed is that 66% of the respondents thought that they were being paid fairly. So I think we know that the gaps that exist with respect to Latinas in the pay gap. So I think the first thing an organization can do is start with the pay equity audit to determine if the procedures around pay, bonuses, other compensation factors are being applied consistently and fairly across the board. I think we also need to address the fact that we know these pay disparities exist. And so conducting an audit isn't enough. We actually have to work to address it. We've had so much research on the disparities, and the disparities have barely moved in the last 3 decades. Latinas make just 57 cents for every dollar that a white non-Hispanic man makes. And so I think, that first step is ensuring that Latinas and Hispanic employees are being compensated fairly. And then we also need to move beyond the wage gap and also ensuring that there's equitable access to resources like leadership development, mentorship, and opportunities throughout the organization to ensure that we're actually having that career growth and advancement. And so when we talk about having a seat at the table, because it's so important to have that seat, it's important to ensure that Latinas are also being listened to and heard, that representation is baseline. That should be the lowest goal that we have. We need to increase that representation, but we need to ensure that people are really included, they really belong, and they really are having those same opportunities within the workforce. And we know that by supporting Latinas, that we will ensure that we're really driving inclusion overall within our organization.
Thank you, Mandy, for that. You're right. Those statistics are really sad to hear about what Latinos are paid or Hispanics are paid, against what the white male is being paid. So thank you for sharing that, because I think some people don't realize how big that gap is and how important it is that organizations are actually looking at, their pay structures to make sure that's equitable across the board. What I also want to ask about, and I'm going to kind of throw this out for the group, but while most Latinx employees feel their companies are making strides in diversity, there's still more work to be done in the areas of inclusion and equity, with only 20% having positive comments about inclusion and only 18% having positive comments about equity. For Thomas, I want to ask you, can you provide examples of some of the work that your organization has done and that continues to do in order to advocate for and improve the experiences of Hispanic employees?
Yeah, I mean, three things. We do a lot, but three things very specifically. Under the title of allyship is very important for us. So we don't do a ton of advocacy. We're moving in that. And the allyship means working with Kanarys to do research and then some other things that gives us a foundation as we start to do a bit more advocacy ourselves, right? And so the allyship also means we serve on the board of HACR with 14 very powerful Hispanic organizations with Sid's leadership. Well, he's the advocate. No one works harder, particularly behind closed doors, for the Hispanic population in this country than Sid does. And we're glad to support that and hopefully be a positive impact on that. Our chapters, we have 47 chapters. Our chapter leaders are like super members, and that means they get continual training and exposure. Just serving on the chapter is training for board training, right? Sid has actually come to the chapter leaders to teach them about being a board and to help them plan for the future. In 10 or 20 years, how am I going to be on a corporate 500 board if I'm young? I've got to create a path. So our chapters are also a great place. And with 47 chapters, I always remind them I have about 250 chapter leaders. We have a staff of 10. So those 250 mostly seasoned advanced degree leaders do a great job of advocacy all by themselves, being out there. And then finally, we do programming. And for instance, we'll do a leadership program, focus on chapter leaders and ERGs. We'll do that in Dallas, say March 10th through 12th, and where we'll do a leadership summit where our programming is continually scored 4.7 out of 5 for 4 or 5 years. So we do it at a high level. And so people come to it for the impact. We'll make it fun too, but it certainly has we get great speakers. Sid's been there a number of times with high impact. That's very much appreciated. Those are just three things. I mean, we do stuff every day, right? Those are three examples of things we do.
Thomas, do you mind sharing when the next leadership training is, when that's coming up, if you have that information handy?
Yeah, so that leadership training is March 10th through 12th. In Dallas, it'll actually be at the Toyota Music Factory. If you haven't been there, it's such a cool new spot at the Westin Hotel, 14 restaurants. We canceled just as the pandemic started there. We were very excited to do an event, and we're very excited to go live and do that event there. So.
Wonderful. And then as you talked about focusing on allyship, is there I guess for those who may be interested in learning more and how they do that, is that something that they would come in for training with your organization as well, or is that something that's just for current members?
I'm sorry, I might have.
Basically, could an outside organization come in and get some training on allyship, or is that something that you talk about and promote within?
Yeah, so it's both, right? So we talk about it because it's an allyship. It's the word of the year by dictionary.com, I believe, right? That just came out yesterday. So allyship is a practice and something we teach to our chapter leaders in terms of operationally, you know, where you should ally with, how you should ally, you know, with both organizationally and finding key champions, allies and organizations. And then, yeah, we do training and certainly other groups do come, right? I mean, a lot of the ERGs that come may not be involved with us during the course of the year much, but they'll come for that sort of thing. Allyship, if it's not a whole program, it's a major thread in a program. It has to be there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Thomas. For Sid, I'm going to turn it over to you. You know, reading books right now, especially during the pandemic, while a lot of people are still at home and working virtual, people are finding themselves reading more books, watching more documentaries, listening to podcasts. Are there any books, documentaries, or podcasts that you might recommend to our audience to help them understand and relate to the Latinx experience better?
Well, sure. Let me answer that in a couple of ways. In terms of what people can watch for, you know, certainly to get the Latinx experience, there are some, you know, great podcasts there are many that are out there. Obviously, one of my favorite is Maria Hinosa from the Futuro Media Group, who's always talking. She has multiple podcasts that are focused on the Latino experience, including news and documentary podcasts. So those are some great examples of that. You know, and then I love, you know, I think documentary movies. One of my favorite is Cesar Chavez, the movie. If no one's ever seen that, I really think everyone should see it because it really gives us an understanding of the whole farm worker experience. Because, you know, as we rise up, we never forget where we come from as a community. And we never forget not only those who pick our food, but those who serve our food as well. Because that wasn't long ago that was me, you know, serving as a server before I went out to Wall Street and becoming a CEO. But I was always trying to educate myself and watching these kinds of podcasts. And I think these are some things to understand our Latino community. But for all of us, you know, I also believe in being points, making sure that we're watching, you know, financial news, reading the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and others, watching CNBC and Yahoo Finance and many other things, so that we know what's going on in the terrain, so that way we know how we can position Latinos into these high ranking roles. But in terms of that experience, there are many ways. I mean, again, Maria Hinosa's podcast is my favorite, but I know that there are many out there that do great jobs. I know that Alicia Menendez does a great one, and even for my Afro Latinos, Emily Homer does an Afro Latinx podcast, which is great, so that we get the full experience.
So thank you so much for sharing those resources with us, Sid. And I want to also just say to the audience too, that if you have any podcasts, documentaries, books, or anything that you enjoy reading or listening to, please share that with us and drop that in the chat. I also noted here in the chat that we are opening it up to questions from our audience. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those in, and I'll do my best to make sure that we get all of those answered in a timely manner. I did have a question that came in, and I want to throw this out here, is how do we, let's see, we've answered a couple of these about registration, so thank you for that, Thomas. Looks like a lot of these questions are around Prospanica, and most of them have been answered, so that's good, thank you. Another question we have is, why is it important for organizations to invest in Hispanic and Latino-focused employee resource groups and networks? Right? There's a lot of organizations now that are realizing the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? They're just now starting to create DEI councils. They're now starting to stand up ERGs. Maybe they had those for women, but that's not necessarily from a multicultural or racial perspective. So I'm going to throw this out to any of the panelists that might be interested in answering this, but why is it important for these organizations to invest in Hispanic ERGs and networks?
Well, let me take the first crack at that because I want to actually modify the question. It's not necessarily why should we be investing in employee resource groups, it's why should the company executives be investing in the employee resource groups? Because these are internal organizations within the companies. Number one is that you have to have an influential executive sponsor. Every ERG group must ask, who is your executive sponsor? Does that executive sponsor have clout? And I define clout as how close are you to the CEO? Because if you're close to the CEO, if you're like one reporting level, that's clout. If you're 10 reporting levels below, that's not a whole lot of clout. And you may need to ask for another executive sponsor. But secondly, is also make sure that the resources are also being invested in our employee resource groups. And then supporting and sending them to organizations like Prospanica and many others that are supporting that ERG development. But the key thing is that the companies have to be intentional in sponsoring and making sure that the executive sponsor is someone of influence. At HACR, we actually do a session in our executive programs to develop the executive sponsors. We actually do that in our executive programs of how to be an impactful executive sponsor and to be that champion for ERG groups.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Thomas.
You go first.
I was just going to say, especially when you look at some of the insights from the report that Kanarys and Prospanica collaborated on, I think it's very evident to see why organizations and leadership teams need to be invested in ERG groups. When you look at the fact, and Natasha, I know you gave some of those statistics on some of the questions that, less than 53% of Latinas report feeling comfortable expressing all aspects of their identity. And Latinas also saying that they don't feel like, people of their background can succeed in the organization. I think it's critical that organizations invest in ERG groups so that you are helping to create those feelings of belonging, that you're creating an opportunity for underrepresented employees to feel connected to each other and create those bonds within the organization. So I think an ERG group is not just a good to have, but it's an essential system of a functioning business and should be treated as such, with employees being compensated for their work that they're doing with the ERGs. And as Sid said, organizations really ensuring that they're dedicating the resources, having executives invested in the ERG groups as well, because these groups are really, really critical to ensuring that employees are feeling connected and a part of the organization.
And I'd like to add, that's a great why, and you guys gave some good examples. There's also some examples when I think invest significantly or impactfully, because a lot of the leaders of their ERGs or BRGs are told something like this: you'll spend 4 hours of your month leading that BRG. Well, that's never true if you want to have impact, right? These are executives or mid-level managers who are involved are not really sure it hurts their career or helps their career. The organization has to ensure it's a positive for their net career, right? That's a type of investment. We'll look at a group like Bristol Myers Squibb. The leaders of their BRGs are full-time paid people in their management training program, so that's investment, right? That's spending $1. It's not here's $5,000, have a great year. It's here's one person and a budget to go with it, to really make an impact. The truth is a lot of people do make impact, but it's because of passion. It's because the people we know who are typically from that community are passionate about what they're trying to do, but they're also sacrificing and feel they're often not recognized, and the investment has to be there also.
Yeah, Thomas, I couldn't agree more. Oh, go ahead, Sid.
Oh, I'm sorry. This will take real quick. Sorry, my apologies, Mandy. One thing that building on what Thomas said is that companies need to recognize that being involved with ERG groups is not an extracurricular event at work. This is part of your work, and it must be communicated to their direct reports, who often are the ones that say, you know, you have an operational job. Why are you participating in this ERG group? The companies need to recognize that when their employees participate in the ERG group, it is not extracurricular activity. This is part of the work that they do, and it should be recognized. Building on what Thomas said. Sorry about that, Mandy.
No, we are all just really adding to each other because couldn't agree more, and was just going to report some of the findings, right? Because we said that when Natasha had this in the lead-in, 63% of Hispanic employees feel that they are tasked with educating others on DEI. And that's why it's key and critical, like you have both noted, for the organization to compensate these employees for the work and to show the value in the work. That if people are taking on roles that are separate and apart from their full-time job, they need to be compensated for that. And just because you are Hispanic or a person of color doesn't mean that it's your job to teach or to lead the organization in these endeavors. And so if you are being given that task, which is a full-time job, you know, there are organizations, many, right, that have full-time DEI staff. And so if you are really expecting your employees to be leading your DEI initiatives, you need to be compensating them for that.
Thank you all. I was going to add something there, but you all touched on so many different things. So thanks for sharing. And there's several questions in the chat. So I'm going to jump over to one of the questions here from Betty. It says, what are your companies doing to increase utilization of Hispanic-owned businesses? I think it's important not only to work internally, but you also need to ensure your suppliers represent your employees and leaders too. So what are the question is, what are companies doing to increase utilization of Hispanic-owned businesses? Or what would you recommend? I might tweak that a little bit. What would you recommend to other organizations to help increase their supplier diversity needs with Hispanic-owned businesses?
So I'll take a crack at that, because at HACR, we actually have something called the Corporate Inclusion Index. This past year, 94 companies participated in the survey. It measures corporate responsibility in the 4 areas of our measurement, which is employment, philanthropy, governance, and procurement. And we know that procurement and supply diversity, I'm even involving that to say business diversity, because that includes technology, Hispanic focused companies, is not at the level where it should be. And this is where not only making sure that everyone, not just your head of supplier diversity, but also everyone that's in the supply diversity initiative is important. And ERG groups can actually play a role in this. ERG groups can actually call in the supply diversity leaders and say, as Latino employees, what are you doing to making sure that Hispanic businesses are getting their fair share of those business opportunities? And that's just tier 1. But when you're talking to suppliers, what are you doing making sure that the suppliers is also subcontracting and making sure that there's diversity, which is a tier 2 supplier diversity? These are the things that we know need to happen, because we know right now the numbers are dismally low in terms of the amount of business that goes to Hispanic businesses, which according to the US Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, you're talking about over 4 million businesses that make up over $800 billion in sales, but that's a fraction, a small fraction, maybe 1% of the true opportunity of what can be done. But ERG groups can make a difference, executive leaders can make a difference, corporate board directors can make a difference, but it must be allyship, which, as Thomas mentioned, is the word of the year, because we all have to be a part of promoting supplier diversity and business diversity, because it's not just supply of the goods and services, it's also supplying technology, where we're seeing more Hispanic organizations, more Hispanic businesses go into that space, but don't always fit into that supply diversity initiative.
One of the things I just add is, although we see, lots of larger organizations that have supplier diversity programs, that it's important, right, that mid-sized organizations also have supplier diversity programs. And when we think about our procurement process, we don't have supplier diversity on the side that contracting with diverse suppliers is a part of our normal procurement and vendor process. And so, as we work with organizations and talk with them, how do you ensure, right, that you are involving MBEs within your procurement process is educating, right? Everyone in the procurement system, everyone who's looking at vendor selection, that ensuring that you're looking at diverse suppliers is a requirement. Not the supplier diversity team is looking at supplier diversity, but this is built into your vendor selection process, and you're going out and actively seeking out diverse suppliers. And so that's something that we really are seeing more organizations do, but there's a lot of work to be done, because it really is in a silo that the supplier diversity team is working on this, but the overall kind of contracting and procurement teams may not really be considering and thinking about diverse suppliers as they're engaging.
Yeah, I'll only add that I think I mentioned earlier that as an organization, we don't have to work to ensure our pipeline of suppliers, the way we operate, is full, because it is always very full. I get it. People want to do something passionate and familiar, and so they see Prospanica and they want to work with us. The only time it hasn't was when we looked for out of office cloud space, right? And that was male dominated, not very diverse. Because I asked the question, why is this not a diverse pipeline? Because that's our requirement. It should be diverse, but it's so easy for us. One thing some people miss is our network has been unique, right? Started as a national MBA network. And people come to our conference, well, there's a career expo part to it, but a lot of business owners come to meet the corporation and other business owners, to network and to look for it. So we foment that in many ways. Sometimes we work with United's USHCC, the Hispanic Chamber, but we do create a network and a forum for them to get together as well. So.
Thank you for that, Thomas. I wanted to go back to a question that Samantha had here in the chat as well. I believe this may have come in when we were talking about ERGs and the support, and said you were speaking about sponsorship and making sure that that sponsorship is close to the CEO level, right? Her question is, she finds that executives are more than willing to be a sponsor. They need assistance on what to do. Any recommendations on resources? I'm assuming here resources for senior leadership to help guide them with guiding their ERGs.
Yeah, well, for one, I would encourage them to participate in our HACR executive programs, where we actually teach executives how to be executive sponsors, number one. But even aside from that, is that it's important for them to first agree to make time, because if part of it is just being there and listening. It's because the executive sponsor is going to listen to some of the feedback, and because the executive sponsor is by definition a sponsor, because as you know, a mentor talks to you, a sponsor talks about you, a mentor spends time with you, a sponsor spends their credibility on you. So an executive sponsor is effectively there mostly to listen, so that as they speak, when the ERG group's leaders are not in the room, that executive sponsor is sharing that feedback. So the number one thing that an executive sponsor can do is listen.
Yeah, I think
I love that.
Go
ahead, Thomas.
No, the only other say this has been a question in Connecticut. When I was in the Connecticut chapter, I don't know, about 20 years ago, we created the first ERG summit. And so this is a great reason for ERG leaders. I mean, of course, Sid's spot on and identifying who's a mentor, who's a sponsor, is that programming that we do, programming that HACR does, and being able to exchange with your ERG leaders, either regionally or across the country, is very important to learn the subtle and maybe even soft techniques, if you will, about how to make that executive comfortable, how to make them feel successful if they're going to be your sponsor, right? So because there's that credibility element. So you'll go to these things and you'll hear half a dozen great examples of what someone else already did to be successful in that, because it can be tricky. There's a bit of an art to it, right? Because it's not just a business play. It's a personality play. It's a communication play, and that can be tricky. Specifically, can be tricky in certain corporate cultures.
Thank you for answering that, Thomas. Another question that came in, I want to make sure that we address this. We started to touch on it a little bit, but I think it's a really important question, especially during this pandemic. To what extent is health equity on the radar screen? Right. So from a mental health perspective, to what extent is health equity on the radar screen? And I'm gonna add a little bit more and just say, especially as we're talking about the Hispanic community in particular.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in here first, and then I'm sure Sid and Thomas will have some more to add. So, right now we've seen a lot of folks are calling it the Great Resignation, an influx of people leaving the workplace, due not only because of the stress of the pandemic, but everything that is brought with it, right? As far as having to figure out childcare needs and other needs for dependent care. And then we've seen this disproportionately affect the Hispanic community and other communities of color. And so when we look at the effect that the pandemic did, I know Thomas talked about it earlier on COVID itself, right? And the health issues that it caused, but that trickled through employment and through the workforce as well. And so we saw those communities disproportionately affected with respect to leaving the workforce as well. And so when we think about what other support that companies need to be providing with respect to mental health, there's a lot of things that companies can do. And I think the first thing is acknowledging that your employees are struggling and that there needs to be additional support provided. I think kind of acting as we're all operating as business as usual, especially because people have started to go back and operate in a hybrid environment, doesn't mean that people are still not getting sick, that people are still not trying to deal with the challenges from a family standpoint. So I think it's very important that we train managers on how to support employees during these time, that we are ensuring that people know what to look out for when it comes to stress or mental health concerns within the workplace, that managers are able to spot those. And we talk openly around the resources that the organization has. Having mental health support and resources is not something that people should be taboo about. It's not something that people should be ashamed of. And I think it's important for organizations to talk openly about it and the support that their organization is able to provide to their employees.
Yeah, let me just add to Mandy. HACR is actually one of the original signers of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. And one of the key components of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion is calling on companies to create a safe space for their employees to have many of those difficult conversations, because we know that when there are things that happen externally outside of the company, it has a mental health impact. If you come into the workspace and you feel like you can't have a discussion about what's happening. Certainly, there's no question when you have situations like what happened with El Paso, Texas, that impacted Latinos. When you looked at what happened with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, with Omar Rodriguez of CNN, who got arrested for doing journalism while being a Black Latino, and all these things that come into the workplace and has an impact, and then you magnify that with COVID, it means corporations have to do more to create that space to allow us to have those conversations, which can certainly foster and address issues that are impacting not only mental health, but also that sense of empathy and understanding.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Sid said. I'm sorry, Natasha.
No, go right ahead, Thomas.
Essentially, when we look at the impacts very specifically in the last 2 years, other than the normal trauma that people of color go through pre-pandemic, it has definitely been significant trauma that must be addressed. And this should be the opportunity for healthcare equity, right, across the board. Now, so we all have to be mindful of that, even in our organization. And as leaders, we have to be role models for that. I've missed for some of it myself, but Prospanica has been providing some sessions, if nothing else, for mental health. And we have one coming up in 2 weeks Oddly, because of an illness, I don't have somebody to post it right now. But so this is it's always been important and often overlooked. It is urgent right now for our communities.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head, Thomas. It's urgent. It's not even a nice to have. It's a necessary. And so if you aren't doing something for your employees right now from the mental health perspective and allowing them time as needed to break away and do what they need to do to take care of things and put things in perspective with life right now, you need to make sure that you're doing that and you're listening to your employees and hearing their needs. So with that being said, we only have a couple of minutes left before we wrap up. I think I've addressed all the questions in the chat so far, so thank you to our audience for joining us and connecting with us and providing questions, great questions for our panelists today. I'm just going to do a quick round robin, if I can give each of you all maybe 30 seconds to share just last words that you'd want to leave our audience with today, knowing everything that we talked about today. We discussed so many different things, but what is the one thing you want to make sure, and knowing that we've got everyone from those in the HR, those in the DEI space, executives and leaders and owners of different organizations, as well as employees and students that may be on this call, what's the one thing that you want to leave with them as it relates to the Hispanic community in the work environment?
Sure, I'll jump in first. So I think it's important, and I know that we've all said it in one way or the other, that organizations are intentional. I'm going forward, Sid, use your acronym DI squared, right? That we cannot depend on employees to lead our DI strategy, that it's important that organizations engage with DI experts, consultants. All of our organizations obviously have those abilities and expertise as well, but you have to be have that same type of intentionality and rigor that you do with every other business priority that you do with DEI. DEI is not something that we can just have one training on or have one courageous conversation and say we're done. We have to have a long-term strategy, a long-term plan. We have to ensure that we're using data to really tackle these issues and to measure our effectiveness and growth with respect to not only the challenges that our employees are having in the workplace, but really knowing, right, how do we create that intentional strategy? And so the one thing that I would leave organizations with is, DI is a journey, and that we really need to ensure that we're bringing in experts to help lead and guide them and not kind of depending on their employees that may not be trained and have the background to lead their DEI strategy.
Thank you, Mandy. I'll go over to Thomas.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I suppose the one thing we've talked about a lot, and one of the threads, we certainly don't have time to focus on, even though it's kind of apparent here, is being committed and intentional how we work together, right? So the truth is, though we've suffered this great trauma, we have great opportunity. It's embedded in there, and if one of the elements of working together as a community, yes, with the allies, but working together, we can be successful in moving the needle significantly, right? And getting it to where it needs to be and moving the country closer to a finished business, not an unfinished business.
Thank you, Thomas. And I'm going to close out with you, Sid.
Well, let me first close out by first thanking Kanarys and thank Prospanica for this opportunity. Thanks for everybody for participating. I want to just emphasize, let's not forget our American Latinas. We know that the numbers for Latinas are incredibly low. And we all, especially as males, as Latinos, we need to be allies to advance Latinos and women of color. The fact that there's only one Latina CEO of any Fortune 500, of any corporation at all, and there's 2 African-American women who are Fortune 500, it goes to show you that that we have a lot of work to do, but we all have to be allies together in this movement. And I always like to say that when we plan to achieve as a community, but we dare to exceed in terms of making an impact, then great results you will see. When you plan to achieve, but dare to exceed, then great results you will see. Pa'lante, mi gente.
Thank you so much, Sid. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you spending the last hour with us. As noted in the chat, this was recorded and will be sent out to everyone who registered today. And I'm going to close, Sid, by using your comment from earlier, that mentors speak to you and sponsors speak about you, and that executives just need to take the time to listen. So if we all do that, we'd be able to help one another in our Hispanic community and all communities of color as we work together to move forward in the CEI journey. So thank you all for your time today. Thanks for allowing me to moderate, and look forward to keeping in touch with everyone. Take care and be well.
Great, thanks everybody.